For Japan set to release Fukushima plant water into the sea, in Washington, D.C., Dr. Wu Changhua, Executive Director and Professional Association, China's Environment. In Anchorage, Rick Steiner, Professor of Marine Conservation Biologist from the University of Alaska. In Beijing, Ma Jun, Director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs and founder of the Blue Map app. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. I want to start by asking exactly what are we talking about? The treated but still radioactive water on the Fukushima plant. What exactly is the nature of this water? Professor, shall we go to you for answer first?
It's a very important issue, and I think it has not gotten the sort of international attention that it deserves. What's in the water, we understand, is about 62 or 63 radioactive nuclides from the Fukushima Daiichi meltdown. They've been using this water to cool the reactor cores that are very hot and then funneling the water into these tanks. Plus there's groundwater flowing into this area as well. So it's radioactive. There's cesium-137, very toxic radionuclide, tritium, a special form of that. There's carbon-14, cobalt-60, strontium-90, there's plutonium, iodine-129. There's all sorts of radionuclides that are associated with a nuclear fission power plant that are in this water. Some of it can be treated and removed, but the existing system that TEPCO and the Japanese government have used there has not worked. There are better systems that can get this water down to almost non-detectable levels of radionuclides, but they haven't chosen to use those.
Has the IAEA and other international organizations been looking at it recently and know what is exactly inside or not?
I don't know the last visit they had there, but even TEPCO, the owner of the plant, has been very non-transparent about what's in the tanks. They only finally reported that there's carbon-14 in the contaminated water in these tanks just last year. It was suspected long before, and there's all sorts of other nasty radionuclides in the water. We know that IAEA knows this as well. 1.23 million tons of this water in these 1,000 tanks. It needs to stay there for another, I'd say, decade or so until we get the water properly treated and processed.
Mr. Ma, you were an expert about water, particularly the environmental issue of water in China. Looking from afar, what do you make of the possible move from the Japanese government?
There are different options, but the Japanese government want to take what they, in their minds, the easiest or the cheapest way, that is to dump the waste directly into the Pacific Ocean. The real problem is that all this are based on mostly the self kind of monitoring or research by the TEPCO company. But unfortunately, this company has lost its credibility and doesn't deserve the public trust. You know, from the very beginning, a whole series of human errors by this company has led to such a disastrous result. And also, you know, it even involves a covering up or, you know, at least sharing a lot of misleading information that even got the decision makers, the leaders in Japan, furious. In quite a few occasions, it's not transparent to the neighboring countries and the countries downstream, you know, Canada, United States. I think that the problem is that this should not be a decision of the sovereignty decision, because it's going to have an impact the largest ocean on the earth, and also affect the other countries and regions. So there's a consultation process that is necessary.
Now, Ms. Wu, there have been already countries around the Pacific protesting against the latest nature of move from the Japan side. For example, China and South Korea has responded by calling on Tokyo to consider it carefully and with transparency.
You know, there's a general sort of failure on the international or global environmental governance. Somehow this, tragedy has been left mostly in the hands of the Japanese government to handle that, Japanese companies, Japanese government to handle that. And they sort of hijacked the International Atomic Energy Agency to be with them, right? And as the voice, actually, in order to protect them, the reputation of the Japanese government there. So yes, absolutely, Chinese government, South Korean government, have been doing the right thing in terms of really calling for voicing the concerns and calling for more actions there. But it's not adequate. United States, Canada, Russia, all the other related countries at least should be joining hands and to have a broader consultation among them and figure out what the solutions should be. Governments need scientific evidence, data to support their positions, and also supporting decisions. From technology perspective, there are solutions there that need to be deployed. In terms of when to, dispose or discharge the water, scientific community has, more scientific-based solutions, that timeline, right? And rather than now, probably should be postponed to maybe, a decade after today. So all those issues need to be put on the table, and at least actually by the major related countries in that region.
Professor Steiner, it's important to understand not only about what it means to human beings, but also to the environment in the sea. What does that mean to marine life? What does that mean to the ecosystem? One of the things people talk about is tritium. Now, according to the Japanese side, it has been already met the so-called standard, but such a huge amount of radioactive water being thrown into the sea, what would that mean short and long term? Will Japan still be a viable player in providing seafood, both for its own people and for the others around the world? What would it mean for fishing village and communities from other countries that are around the Pacific? All of these, I really need some answer.
And we have a lot of experience, a lot of understanding of that from other disasters around the world. Hydrogen bomb testing in the Pacific in the 1950s and 60s by the U.S. and then Soviets on their soil deposited a lot of carbon-14, radioactive carbon in the oceans. We have found that everywhere. It was just reported in little bugs at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, 11,000 meters deep, the deepest part of the world ocean. So this stuff over decades flows with currents. It does not degrade quickly. The half-life of carbon-14, again, is 5,700 years. Mm-hmm. So that's a long period that this stuff will still be in the environment. It is absorbed into phytoplankton, and all these isotopes, most of them anyway, are absorbed into phytoplankton, then zooplankton, then fish, and then they're concentrated on up the food chain into marine mammals, the terminal predators in the ecosystem. And there have been seals, for instance, in some areas in the Irish Sea and the Barents Sea that have come up with blood cancers from nuclear waste disposal into the sea in those areas. So we know that these are really hazardous. They last a long time. And whatever is dumped off of Fukushima, we know where it's going to go. It's exactly where the radiation went before, all the way across the North Pacific Drift then the water splits. Some of it comes up to Alaska, where I am, and some of it goes down past Washington, Oregon, and California. And there was radioactive Fukushima nuclides monitored in all of these locations pretty quickly after the disaster. That's exactly what will happen with this big pulse of radioactive water. So there are, and to my esteemed colleagues on the panels, you're absolutely right. It is embarrassing to me as an American citizen and an environmental scientist that my government has not stepped up and weighed in on this issue, and the same with Canada and the same with Russia. We are all downstream of this. We are all potentially exposed by this proposed release. So these governments need to weigh in robustly with China, Korea, and Japan and come up with a more robust, environmentally rational solution. And that's at least to pause any release for 10 years, as Ms. Wu suggested, at least for 10 years. Then the tritium degrades, and we have filtration, this ion exchange system by Purolite in the United States that can filter all this stuff out. But it takes time to do it, it's expensive, but we'd much rather do that than dump all of the stuff in the North Pacific.
If geopolitics have become a factor in the final decision-making process, how sad or tragic would it be, whether to open your eyes to a potential disaster, if it is, of the environment?
I mean, one could argue that Fukushima disaster 10 years ago was an accident. It was we should have been able to envision it by the way they located the auxiliary generators down where a tsunami could take them out and then not pump the cooling water. That was poor engineering. But this would be an intentional release of radioactive contaminated water into the North Pacific that would then expose Canada, Alaska, and the west coast of the United States and Hawaii as well. And that is morally and ethically, I think, unacceptable in the 21st century. In the 20th century, we used the oceans, the human society did, as a dumping ground. We dumped all sorts of things into the oceans. We can no longer afford to do that. And so we need these governments to set aside whatever geopolitical arguments they're having at this time between Russia and the United States and China and Japan, and come together and get a realistic solution for the future here. We can do it. The solutions are there. We just need the political will by the Japanese government to do it.
Mr. Ma, we understand it's not only other countries that are protesting, but also the fishing community within Japan as well. Will communities be able to make a big enough voice?
It's fully understandable for them, for the fishery community, to make their voice their opposition, because the Fukushima Daiichi disaster 10 years ago already have hit this community so badly. Now I think the fishery is I've seen some reports that it's only just recovered by about 20% of the original 10 years ago, and now with this discharge, even if we don't talk about all the signs, Professor Steiner have very clearly listed. But even if we don't talk about this impact, just the impression that this is going to give to the consumers in Japan, and then the consumers in China, in Korea, in other parts of the world, going to be quite damaging to this community. So I really respect what the fishery communities are doing in Japan. Having said that, I visited Japan a few times, and I have the chance to get together with the local grassroots groups. It's really what they're doing is really admirable. But in the meantime, that society is also quite top-down, I have to say. The government, have a lot of say, and to my great surprise, companies like TEPCO actually have maybe an even greater say when it comes to how to handle this type of disaster and the disposal of such a hazardous wastewater. I mean, this should be a national decision made, but TEPCO has been basically given the power, a lot of power to decide how to handle this, and even during the crisis situation. So I think that's actually a big problem.
The other question is also important. We are talking about climate change, right? But what about, this very obvious environmental hazard? Are we, just trying to look at one issue while hiding away from all the other obvious issues?
No, I think definitely we all know climate change is a recognized biggest existential threat to humanity for this century. But in the meantime, we have many other ecological, environmental security risks that are threatening the life for not only for human beings but also for nature, for the ecosystem there as well. Interesting enough, if you look at the process of global efforts to address climate change challenges, I have to say, I think we've achieved a tremendous amount of progress already, because if you look at the largest economies, we're all leading, committed to net zero carbon neutrality around the mid of century. So now what takes actually is actions, not just talk about it, actions there. In the meantime, the international community has to spare more and more attention to other issues like what we're talking about here today. Rather than being distracted by some countries, using geopolitics tools, instruments, or tricks even, but rather look at the reality. Historically, if you look at all the radioactive, the bombs, the testing, whatever, like Professor Steiner mentioned early on, they've already impacting human life. That's human rights issue, right? Back then, maybe a few decades ago, no one was holding the major players accountable, but they're already killing people, damaging people's health. We need to talk about it, actually. So historically, we need to really dig out all those issues, facts, evidence, data, using the history as a perspective to look at what's happening today, right? And I think that offers a strong foundation for an international consultation process, at least by major countries related in the region. But more important, I think the United Nations need to step in, right? And to become the leading platform for international community to come together to address issues there.
I remember very clearly when the two sides, China and the United States, with the latest strategic talk in Anchorage, Alaska, the Secretary of State from your country has been talking about this place being chosen because of its environment. It's a beautiful place and a quiet life, people nice. And how do you see the whole issue and the framing of the issue today?
I think the takeaway here is that we all live downstream of someone else upstream. And so we all have a collective responsibility for a global raising of our standards for reducing pollution and reducing overharvest of all sorts of natural resources, and for resolving climate change and all sorts of seemingly intractable environmental stressors that we're imposing on the biosphere. But yeah, Alaska would receive some of these radioactive nuclides in this released contaminated water. We received some of it from the actual disaster in 2011. But the other thing that your previous question poses is the issue of climate change. We all often hear nuclear fission energy invoked as a solution to high carbon energy production systems. And here we see very clearly in Fukushima the faults of that sort of logic. It's going to take probably the rest of this century to effectively deal with the disaster at Fukushima. And even then, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars will have been spent on it. All sorts of human lives have been disrupted and all sorts of environmental damage from the initial disaster. And now if they actually release this contaminated water, additional damage. So adding all that up together, it doesn't make sense to use nuclear fission where we haven't really worked it out safely as a solution to our energy problem. So, but I hope that, as my esteemed guests, colleagues here on the show have mentioned, it is a time for the world community to step up, international scientists and governments to step up and help Japan and TEPCO, join together with finances and scientific wherewithal and technology to solve this problem. It's not just Japan's problem, it's the world's problem.
Yeah. Rick Steiner, Ma Jun, and Wu Changhua, such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your contribution.